Zubaida, thank you so much for that, not only a very warm introduction, but also inspiring summary of the conference, to which issues we continue to turn. And like you, I also encountered Ahdaf's talent and love and skill with the presence of objects and the telling of stories through the life of objects, and the presence, if you like, of the museum in your writing. But I also know that you have museum feet, and you are a great denizen of museums, having visited not a fair few of them with you in various different places. And so, to the heart of the matter, one of the themes that concerns us very greatly here in this moment, which is, to you, what is a museum for?
Right. Well, first of all, thank you to the Museum Association for having me, and it's really interesting that I should come to your conference for the first time, having moved away from a museum. It's really actually very good to be with you. I would have been here for the 2 days, except that I was only able to fly in today. And I know that there was a session where this question of what is a museum for was discussed, and I wish I could have been there so that I don't simply repeat things that you've already said. But I guess this is a question that's been around ever since museums started existing, and I think it's a question that probably has attracted different answers at different times. And I think it's really, really important, because in my experience, people spend a great deal of time working, talking, discussing how to allow a museum to do what it does, rather than why it's there in the first place. So fundraising, legal issues, logistics, policy, but it all, of course, in the end, comes down to why should we care? Why are museums there? What are they for? Why do they matter? So as well as being some of them being brilliant places to take your kids to at the weekend, I think they perform a really important function in that they, of course, we have lots and lots of different kinds of museums, but on the whole, museums hold the past. And so we might as well ask, what is the past for? What is the use of the past? And I imagine that the use of the past, or a really important central use of the past, is to inform our present and to direct, inspire how we think about our future and how we go into it. And of course, museums, because they have objects, again, traditional museums, they are in an amazing position to narrativize the past and to objectify it, that you're actually seeing, you're actually in contact with things that have come down, to you across the ages from the past. And there's a power there, and there's a magic there. And there's a huge responsibility, because who is it who tells the narrative? Who is it who decides what's on display and what isn't, and what it's next to, and how it's contextualized, and what the story is that it tells? And in all those decisions, politics and ethics are involved. And so I think that museums are there to help us, and to help particularly the young who are first exposed to them, to see what the stories are of the past, and to use that information to think about the present and the future and how they would want them to be.
You use the word responsibility there. And in that context, what do you think are the responsibilities of publicly funded institutions, not only at all times, but in times of particular political intensity and or change?
Yeah, well, I mean, this, of course, is, a large part of what happened, which has led to my being here today. I very much believe that as well as the responsibility for the narrative, I mean, I think museums believe that they have a responsibility for the objects that they hold. They have a responsibility for their safety, for their conservation, and so on. And that is, of course, completely true. But they also have a responsibility to see that they are deployed in the best possible way. And that, of course, is interpretable. What people think at different points of history, what people with different politics think, will determine what they think the best possible way is. So there's a responsibility there in determining what stories they tell, but I think also because, and of course, I would always think that the responsibility is to find the cohesive line, the line that draws humanity together, and that is the sort of overarching line. But I think that beyond the internal of how we use a collection and what narratives we tell, I think that certainly big public cultural institutions have a responsibility in how they position themselves with regard to the big moral and political questions of the time. I mean, in theory, it's possible to think of times where things were so stable and so okay that you didn't have to think about that. Possibly, I can't immediately think of one, but certainly the times that we live in are not those. So if you live in a time, for example, where we're living in a time of great change. We're living at a time when very, very many of us, and I know that very, very many of the people here in this room, because of the little bits that I have heard, feel that we're really at a fork in the path, and the direction that we all take is massively important. So we have issues of climate change, we have issues of social justice, we have issues of neoliberal capitalism, we have obviously issues of being post-colonial. And what does this all mean? And it seems to me that it means that institutions that have a lot of influence and that have a lot of weight because of history, because of the nature of their holdings, because of their reputation, because of their size, should, and who actually, institutions that, for example, have free entry and therefore see themselves as somehow facilitating education and facilitating sort of general conversations and positions in society, then they have a responsibility to position themselves ethically on the big issues of the time. And so, for me, I think I would like to add that at this time, this moment that we are living, I think it is the young who are the guide of the world to how the world should behave. I think that they are demonstrably right on issues of ethics and of the environment, of sustainability, of the planet, of social justice, of inclusion. And I also think that they are the ones who are going to live in the world for, the next period. And so they have a say. And so I really think that, that it's very wrong that they should always be placed in a position of opposition, of not having, the power and this. And I think that one of the jobs of large cultural institutions and large cultural figures who have power is to empower the young and to facilitate their positions and to make it possible for their positions to become policy.
That phrase, I mean, that's the cohesive line, that phrase that you use, the line that draws humanity together. And I mean, here in this instance, but as elsewhere, as in Tahrir and the Egyptian Revolution, which was again being in a context of enabling and facilitating and engaging with youth, that relationship between the cultural institutions of the establishment, because there's a difference between the bigger, older institutions and the nimbler, smaller, more innovative, creative ones, and the young. Is that how it takes place in change of policy?
Well, I mean, it has to be in change of policy because I mean, issues like funding, for example, are issues of policy, and we know that we're talking about fossil fuels and about art washing, and as you know, this was one of the reasons, the three big reasons why I resigned, because I believed that the museum policy should be to divest from BP. Or, I mean, it just seemed so clear that the banners, the publicity, the whole, the level and type of publicity that was afforded by the museum to BP was, well, it was, in practical terms, it was far in excess of the money that they were paying for it. It just
sort of disproportionate value.
It was disproportionate. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want it anyway, but it was also disproportionate. And so for me, it actually kind of meant somehow that there was a taking of sides happening, and while the world was, or the young of the world are up, about fossil fuel, and while we have the science, and we have, I mean, the information is out there, and people have voiced their concern in no uncertain terms, and they've put forward arguments. We have many people here today from the activist groups that have been working on this and that have put forward really strong, undeniable arguments as to why BP and companies like that are harming the world and harming the world for future generations. It's all there. So why do you give this industry this type of marketing? And what does that mean when you are an establishment that welcomes school children in, that is supposed to have that role, that kids, schools bring children in. I mean, one of the wonderful things that happened for the BM was that the history of a world in 100 objects then was inspiring and adopted in education, and that is the kind of relationship that you want between a cultural institution of that magnitude and the coming generations. And so to kind of like fly in the face of that for what is not very much money, I mean, that for me is a political act, in fact.
Because it suggests that there's something more to the nature of the relationship and the investment and the investiture in power than the money, than the figure itself. I mean, talking about your resignation from the board of the British Museum in July, you've talked about that aspect of the BP funding. Were there other aspects? What did you feel was lacking?
I felt, obviously I will only say what I've said in public. I felt there was too much insulation between the board and what was happening outside the boardroom. And I felt, as I have felt with other institutions, that there was a kind of insistence on stasis, on everything remaining the same. This is how it's always been done, and this is how it will continue to be done, and this is what the real world is like, and everything else is, it's great, have your opinions, and it's lovely, and young people should have opinions and should feel very strongly about things, and now we're letting you have your opinions, and now we carry on with the real business of running the world. And you can see that across the board. We saw that in, for example, the way that that workers' issues were dealt with, and this whole outsourcing thing. And then you have people who, coming into work even though they are not sure if they're going to be paid, and
the Carillion
situation. Yeah. And some organizations did take back the workers, but again, the way that was, it didn't become a central issue in any way. It was like the protests of the young about fossil fuels. It was like, this is happening and it will pass, it will be dealt with, and everything will carry on in the same way, because that is how things carry on. And it's really strange that, and there's something, sort of another aspect to this, which is you get the argument back that, actually, it isn't the fact that this museum takes money from BP that changes anything. What you want is for everybody to stop using motor cars and for everybody to stop, flying anywhere. And so you say, well, actually, I'm not asking you to take down BP. I'm just asking you to not do your bit of this, to not take that particular little bit of money and give it that huge publicity. But there's an insistence on dealing with it. It's as if it's the same thing as when people press on boycott. Why should you boycott? It's wrong to boycott. Well, actually, it isn't. Boycotting is my personal choice and protest against a system that I believe is wrong. It is the only thing that I, as a private individual, can do to make my position felt, to refuse to engage. So to tell me that it's wrong to refuse to engage, and that in fact I must engage because, you see how it all hangs together. It's a whole,
I mean, just thinking about it, because we can, being in a sort of professional environment and with people sort of working and running institutions at all different levels. And also because it's a question that interests me, having sat on them and continued to sit in them and resigned from a few myself. But I sometimes wonder what boards are for, and I don't mean that in any way, in a glib or a light way. I think that if culture is about the preservation for what we've had in the past and what we've got for the future, and that the responsibility of these structures is to do that, then there is this, particularly in this instance, that is a fundamental contradiction. But what are boards for in a modern, contemporary context?
Yeah, well, it depends. I mean, boards in the United States, for example, are mostly to fund a place. So you don't have a place on the board unless you're prepared to put millions and millions of dollars in the place. I think what is also, I'll come back to this, but I think what is also interesting is the disconnect. So in the British Museum, for example, it's perfectly clear that at curator level, at community outreach level, at ground level, the work that's being done is, they don't have the ability to say BP or not BP, but certainly...
That's the Royal Shakespeare Company, and they don't anymore.
Yeah. Quite, yeah, well done, yeah.
To be P or not to be P?
But certainly in issues of, like reaching out to communities, like really democratic grasswork, like creating networks of curators and people across the world who work together on equal footing with exchange of skills and so on. It's all happening. But it's at the top level that things kind of like, stay very still in an old science. So, I mean, the particular board that I walked out of was really absolutely brilliant on issues of governance, on issues of dealing with the law and on ideas for fundraising, on advocacy with government, and on securitization. I mean, that kind of thing, and on construction and where to build what and how to. That was all terrific. But it stopped there. So on the issues that ultimately feed into the question of what is a museum for, and how should a museum position itself in the world, it was, that was not really what it was concerned with. I mean, as long as certain parameters were there, that it was a very big lender, it was a generous lender, it had sort of, good exchange programs, and it was, approving the redeployment of the collection to tell a better and more joined up and human narrative, then that was enough. I think a board should do more than that. I think a board should steer, particularly in times like this, a board should steer an organization in a direction, in an ethical direction.
You mean ethics?
In an ethical direction, and should steer an organization in a way that is consonant with concerns about the planet, the world, and the way that is run, or rather not run, the way it's collapsing.
I just heard that there were jokes happening, so I came to sit down. But also, I think as brilliant a job as Rachel did there, I feel like other people may also have questions. This is I'm so excited that I can't even speak. You guys have got a really impressive opportunity to ask questions of one of the foremost minds in our country and of our generation. So what are you asking? And while you were thinking of that, I'm almost tempted to turn the entire format around and say, what would you want to ask some of the people who are sat on boards in this room in terms of... But that perhaps is possibly a bit too much pressure and a bridge too far. But
well, I would say that I'm really encouraged. I mean, I've spent the afternoon here, and I have seen a level of sort of commitment to the issues, passion for change, engagement, and and a level of discussion that I mean, I'm not surprised. Why would I be surprised? But I'm very, very heartened.
That's encouraging.
I mean, you're pretty militant. I like that.
Not militant enough, but we're getting there. Just really know. It's just. I know you're nervous, but ask them quickly because we've got to get out by 6. So I don't want you being grumpy at me because you missed your train because you were all sat there going, I'm not sure whether I should ask a question. Anybody?
We're good. Or anyone?
Oh, and one at the front. Thank you, Clara. Sorry, guys. Mic at the front, please, quickly. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Clara Paylard. I work for the Liverpool Museums, but I'm also the president of the PCS Culture Group, who represented the British Museum workers who came out in your support. So thanks on their behalf. And I'd just take the opportunity to put it on record that for 5 months, the British Museum refused to actually engage with those workers or their unions, and then transfer the work to a different company that immediately put people on 3 months contracts. Some of them had worked in the British Museum for 20 to 30 years, so an absolute disgrace. But my question, I guess, is we've been discussing in this conference two of the topics for which you resigned, including repatriation and oil sponsorship, but we haven't really discussed much about workers' rights and privatization and commercialization of those museums, who link up to the theme of capitalism that we've mentioned a number of times. So my question is, do you think the issue of commercialization of culture and privatization should be approached through an ethical lens?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely, it should be. I have no answers to this at all, and I don't know if anybody does. But I think that the questions should certainly be asked. I mean, yes, it is very important to have free museums, free access to culture. Ultimately, who pays? And who pays for culture, basically? I think on like a limited issue, the issue that happened with Carillion, with the workers, I really don't understand how a cultural institution that is to a large extent publicly funded can outsource its workers. I mean, basically, outsourcing workers means that you put a middleman between you and the people who are working in your organization so that they get lower money and that middle person gets money that they should get because you're paying it. In order to what? In order to relieve you of the headache of dealing with them. I think that's wrong anyway. And I don't see why it's necessary. I mean, maybe it's necessary if you're employing 10,000 people, but I don't see why it's necessary in cultural organizations of the size that we have here. And I think that when something like that collapses, then that should be a wake-up call. It shouldn't be that you allow them to do silent protests and send letters to the board and you refuse to even meet with them. So I think the whole outsourcing thing is wrong, and I think other organizations, South Bank Center, some of the historic royal palaces recognized that and took workers back on board. But I almost think that if you get public money, you should not outsource your workers. You have a responsibility to your workers, and you have a responsibility to, deal fairly and humanely. And I'm sure that there are bigger and bigger issues. Well, there are about the commercialization, commodification of culture and art, and they're part of the whole thing. That all the issues that are being and should be discussed. Yeah, and it's all neoliberal capitalism in the end. I mean, it all sort of kind of ends up there, and you need to kind of start at the beginning and untangle it somehow. You young people, not me. I'm through. I've done my bit.
And just following on from something that Ahdaf touched on something that was so central to her work and so important, which is the power of peaceful, non-violent boycott. We sometimes forget how unions have been really important in the history of cultural organisations, and not just industrial organisations. So, for example, in the anti-apartheid movement, you'll probably all remember that it was Equity, the actors, good Lord, who would think it, who came out first, right? So I think it just thinking also about when people are talking about how do we organise together, how do we make our departments talk together. I'm not knowledgeable enough, I don't know, but the question of unionisation and how your unions are functioning is really important and powerful too.
Absolutely. And I also, just to sort of, a last point is that you also, I mean, basically a question of what is the function of culture? I mean, that keeps coming up. What is the function of culture? And isn't culture about communication? Isn't culture about building bridges? And isn't culture about understanding one another? Yeah, that's all fine. But there is a trend, and somebody said in one of the meetings I was in today that there is a trend among sort of upper management to, for example, with the rise of the alt-right, that they have to be given a space as well, and we have to sort of accommodate their points of view. Well, actually, you know what? I don't think so. Because in our position, they do not accommodate our points of view. And I think that while on the whole, one thinks of, and it is healthy and good to think of, human kind of positions and feelings as sort of a spectrum, and to accept that there is a broad spectrum, and that, you know, somewhere along the line we all share stuff with each other, and it's fine if people kind of don't. But sometimes it's binary. Sometimes really things are binary. And I think that it's really quite clear, and it's clear particularly here in England, that we are in a situation which unfortunately is becoming more and more binary. And at that point, you know, your job and the job of culture as you practice it is to stand up for the side that you think is right. And I think that that really has to be our position, because any other is self-destructive.